Okay, there. Started recording. Okay, so I was just about... Can you hear me? I was just about to introduce an idea. Oh, you sound different. You sound quite soft. What?
I have to test the sensitivity.
Okay,
so this should be a little bit better.
Yes, yeah, that's much more audible. So, okay, now this is slightly speculative, so I don't want to sort of completely endorse this idea, but I have this idea that essentially the only active part of the mind is the subconscious, and in some sense, the subconscious is the present mind, is the present context thinking in some sense, or it's the actual home of the ego in some sense, and in relation to it, the ego is a reference point that is almost hypothetically or intellectually developed. That is sort of it's like the conscience of. So the ego is almost the conscience of the subconscious, and the unconscious is actually, in some sense, was the progenitor of the subconscious. But in some sense, yeah, okay, well, I've always made the case that the unconscious is actually the proper seat of consciousness and the self, and was the original inner child. And I still think that that's somewhat true, but I do think that when you have four sides of the mind developed, the subconscious effectively is the only active component that is actually running, and that in some sense the ego is somewhat is a kind of correlated reference point of collected knowledge that the subconscious is kind of implicitly or indirectly generating, and so the record of your thinking is written in the ego, but it's sort of it's always like a kind of contemplative afterthought, whereas the subconscious is actually your mode of sort of present time cognition, whereas like your ego is in the past tense of your sort of your recognition of what you have cognated, and then the unconscious essentially used to be the original center, but after the ego was developed, the ego sort of I think the ego and the unconscious sort of they fall into that same category in some sense, and like the unconscious was the first there, and so when it created this active game to play, which essentially was the subconscious, and then when the ego stole the subconscious away, then the unconscious became essentially susceptible to being repurposed for the ego. And so the ego and the unconscious are sort of more closely akin to one another, and that is why it's so important that the ego dominates the unconscious. And so there is this kind of this sympathetic codependency. But anyway, the reason why I bring this stuff up about the subconscious is because in some sense I think as a conceptual exercise you can reform your own thinking by doing that self-actualization process that I described, which is that you take the trickster and you rehabilitate the trickster function, and you stop essentially the parent from listening to the child, and for the purposes of the child sort of trousing the trickster and projecting it onto your environment, and sort of what are the other words that I had, that it you know, because the parent in some sense is always instigating the trickster, and it's sort of leeching it at the same time. It's got a very kind of parasitic relation to the trickster, and it's doing it for the purposes of the child in some essence. So as you sort of recover the integrity of the trickster, you are at the same time unraveling the importance of the child, and you're sort of discharging all of that. And then at the same time, I think when you are doing that, you can do that all conceptually on some level, you can do that all introspectively, but the thing that's going to loop you back into it is going to be all the habits that you have. And there might be some perceptual habits, sorry, not perceptual, but there might be some conceptual habits that you have in terms of how you deal with things, and a pattern of judgment in some sense. But those are all after the fact. The immediate danger, I believe, is posed by the subconscious, because the subconscious, as I said, is the actual activation. It is the present time activity. It is the actual verb that the ego is essentially the sort of the, so it's weird. People have often said, it's clear that we have different parts of our cognition in that, and I mean that generally, in that you get the observer and you get what is observed, and so in some sense the ego is the observer, but what is being observed, I believe, is the subconscious.
Makes sense. It makes sense from like the standpoint of the subconscious always being this form of like inner processing. So to say that innately, if we weren't displaced on a place such as Earth, and we were displaced in another location, we would innately have the processing and understanding of being able to observe the subconscious for what it is and what it wants to be. But we're stuck with this understanding of what's in front of us, and the ego can't initially escape what is exactly in front of us because it is all displaced and discerned around us. And so to say that we have the subconscious awareness of what we want to be, that there is an inner processing or the verb of something or happening or running or like contextualizing whatever it is that the ego seems to be stuck in, is the conscious awareness with an unconscious intrinsic pull or like some kind of bleeding coming through. But it's all innately on an axis or correlated on some spectrum that's surrounding the subconscious and everything we know about it.
Sorry, just to go into slightly the ontology of this, and I also want to bring up some points that I made earlier that I want to have on the recording in terms of some perhaps tools of speculative therapy, would be that the trickster was the inner child, was the original seat of consciousness, and then essentially it created the subconscious as a game, as something that was fundamentally that it never believed in, but that it sort of did to sort of entertain itself in some sense. It was like literally it was a mask. It was to act in such a way as to sort of be a foil. It was never regarded as having an independent sense of self. It was literally a game. And so when the subconscious was created, it was upsetting to the unconscious in some sense that the subconscious would create its own conscience. And I don't mean its own consciousness, I mean that it developed the ego. It was the ego along with the subconscious that teamed up against the unconsciousness in some sense, because relative to the ego, the subconscious is actually respectable, or like actually an entity. Like, so in the reference system that you independently, just because you played the game of the subconscious, you start to have a natural reactive record of what you are doing. You are judging what so you observe things, and then so the observation itself, the collected observation, is the ego, and the thing that you are observing is the subconscious. So essentially the unconscious is in this, created the subconscious, and the subconscious is furnished by the energy of the unconscious mind, or it becomes unconscious.
Let's see.
Okay, sorry, I'm talking in a bit fragmented way, but sorry, the reason why I brought this up was because sorry, now I lost my thread.
Just to tack onto that, maybe a sentence or two. It seems as though, from what you're saying, it is almost like the unconscious is a collection of data, but almost like the subconscious is a threshold that the ego has collected and sees as a pivotal point of understanding that the ego is able to acquire a point and a threshold that is so almost superior to anything and everything the ego and the unconscious know of, and that is the new mark to meet, or the new understanding of where one can be. And so that almost is idolized as a way of like a focal point that the subconscious almost overtakes the mind, and that we focus on that threshold to hit and reach and breach again, and to overtake it in some way, shape, or form that we've already done, we've already have met. And so that the ego is a continuous collection and is a judgment on to everything that we see and do, because we want to breach that threshold once more and overtake it, which just leads to this configuration of leading out from that point, because we can only go down from a threshold, and how we're going to continuously try to acquire and overachieve that subconscious threshold once more.
So there's just some elements in there that I wanted to speak to, but just to finish my point, I think that basically I'm trying to make the case for two parallel models that have to be kind of understood in tandem. and they are separate.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing about the subconscious, in essence, is that I want to say like the ego and the unconscious are almost fundamentally akin to one another, and the subconscious is like the verb, which is sort of which is the in-between place between the unconscious and the ego, and how the ego sort of ontologically developed. And so the point is that the subconscious is important for the ego because that is how the ego gained dominance over the unconscious, and in some sense the ego's another explanation as to sort of the disunity of the unconscious mind and the unconsciousness of the trickster and the demon perhaps as well is the elevated sort of importance of the subconscious, which the ego derives all of its sustenance from. Like if there was no subconscious, there is no ego in some sense. Like it is you know those things are completely parallel to one another. But as I said, like the subconscious in some sense is that other parallel narrative is like more of in some sense it relative within the actual sort of epistemological connections between these things. It's merely just a metaphor in some sense. It's like it can be completely overlooked. But I'm just bringing it up because I think that if you actually want to sort of deal with this in terms of actually extricating yourself from having an MBTI type, that this complexity I think is going to be a major constituent of sort of how you're going to sort of mediate out like because I think that you could conceptually extricate yourself from the ego and the unconscious and their sort of codependency and such, but the subconscious essentially would be your ongoing mental behavior and activity that will essentially just it will tend to generate more of an ego, and it will tend to come from its source energy, which will be the unconscious. And so you'll sort of you will continue to project SE onto your environment, although you might not do it because for the conceptual purposeful reason of wanting to value your child and have the NE feeding the child, and preserve. Actually, the parent is more preserving the child out of the accusation against the trickster or whatever. But that will just tend to recoalesce if you don't sort of stop the subconscious, and that sort of. So I think in some way, if you want to be, for an example, there are two ways of doing this, and I think you have to eventually you have to do it both ways. You have to conceptually clear up the stuff from the ego and the unconscious sort of codependency, and the sort of the unconscious projection of the parent that is projecting the trickster as a kind of instigator, and then leaching the accusation against it in the form of the value that the child and the domination that the child has. If you were just a behaviorist and you didn't want to deal with all the psychological complexity, you would just say stop the subconscious. Like, see yourself doing the subconscious, actually find the level. I mean, that might be hard to do because you have to kind of fish for that. You know, you have to be like, okay, well, never mind that I'm observing my own mind. What is my behavior? What is the belief in my actual articulation and in manifested and expressed behavior? And sort of just don't do the subconscious. Just stop performing the subconscious that the ego is abstractly, or not abstractly, but intellectually reacting to, or sort of, you know, so you remove the need for a consciousness. Sorry, not a consciousness. You remove the need of a conscience. So it's like, you know, if you don't do something that is doubtful or worrying, there's no recurring sort of trial that you have. There's no recurring sort of beration that you have. There's no internal monologue that you have to have if you just execute your will, as it were. And so the actual stumbling block for executing your will is, in fact, I think, the subconscious. But so in some sense, that package is also, so either you deal with the trickster and sort of retool the integrity and dignity of the trickster, and that will sort of conceptually massage out the war between the ego and the unconsciousness, and and then you at the same time you have to stop doing the subconscious, because it was the unconscious's inclination to make a game of acting out the subconscious that sort of led to the pathological complex that we call adulthood, essentially.
Interesting. So to say that the subconscious is basically the behavioral aspect of what the ego is interpreting via like a thought process or some kind of processing, and then the subconscious is the initial action of the representation of the matrix that is the thought process to the behavioral aspect of who we are. So to say, if we innately have a way of controlling the ways in which we behave according to our process and trying to understand that innately it's two separate things in an equilibrium to one another. Well, excuse me, not two separate things in equilibrium, but maybe become in equilibrium because we are enacting on a thought process. We will initially control the algorithm that is demeaning our happiness, or like not demeaning our happiness, but innately causing a pattern of trying to understand and reform and understand and reform some more.
I mean, the recurring pattern that is caused between the trickster and the parents in the ego is that drama, in essence, is there to privilege the subconscious over the unconscious. Like, in some sense, it's very hard to keep the unconscious because it was there first. It is your original sense of self, and the subconscious was its game. And so when the game produced its own conscience, like its own bad conscience in some sense, and then the unconscious, and then that conscience, which is the ego, basically said, actually, I'm going to rewrite history at this point. I'm going to say, actually, the subconscious is actually my sense of self. So the ego tries to privilege the subconscious over the unconscious. And so it's like the ego, in some sense, is saying the subconscious was who I was before I was the ego, and not and I want to forget about the unconscious, the unconscious. And so, sorry, I had a better way of saying this in my head before I started talking, but like that is the narrative of how it happened ontologically, but it's not. It's you see the epistemological complex and the ontological narrative don't they don't fit neatly together. It is a bit of a convoluted sort of setup, and so the ego is trying to rewrite history and forget about the unconscious mind and sort of privilege the subconscious so that it can not be threatened, because it is, in a sense, it is an irrelevancy. The ego itself is an irrelevant fiction that is only relevant if the subconscious is your true self. And so the ego is trying to say, like, I am the voice, I am the radio voice, and everyone needs to listen to this radio set because it transmits something that is at core relevant, but it's all sort of it's based on it's like watching a comedy show in which people are having they're pretending to have a serious argument about a serious topic. That is like the level at which the ego is sort of epistemologically situating itself. And so the only way that it can sustain that is by fragmenting the unconscious mind and by maligning the trickster, is by maligning the child of the unconscious. And so and therefore privileging its own child. And so in some sense it's weird because it exists in some sense, so it has to continually trouse the trickster, although it has to continually invoke it as well. So it's like a kind of problem solution. The trickster is the trickster has to be constantly battled by the parent of the ego, and the record of that battle is the child in the ego. So and which is also called the stress function, and so and the stress function, even if it grows only a little bit, it perhaps casts quite a large shadow. So it's actually the stress of the child is probably not correlated to what the child has to say. It has to do with the extent of the accusation against the trickster in some sense. And so as you rejuvenate the integrity of the trickster, then your child stops gaining its unjustified significance and importance, and sort of all of the ego sort of completely relaxes, and then what you're left with is the original fuck up. The original problem was that the unconscious mind created the subconscious and started acting that way and started sort of testing it. In fact, the subconscious was the first creation of an artificial intelligence in some sense. So the unconscious mind was like, let me act this way and pretend that I believe that it's really me. That was actually what people did as children. That's how they started to develop. Is they said, adults are weird, aren't they? Like, I'm going to pretend to be an adult. I'm going to model the kind of authority that they sort of invoke, and sort of they started playing in that game. Now, they did already have an unconsciousness, which was their inner child. That they did already have an ego in which they were preferencing functions, which just basically meant that, I mean, perhaps not in any stable sense. I mean, I think that the unconscious without a subconscious, or without the starting of a subconscious, is free to somewhat shift. It is free to perhaps find another sort of, but generally these things from a single grain will already start to kind of implicitly sort of suggest that, because you see the problem, the reason why the unconscious generates the subconscious to begin with, so this is somewhat tangential, is essentially that it gets bored with its mastery. It gets bored with its kind of solipsism and with its self-completeness in some sense. And this has to do perhaps with the issue of oh yeah, I don't want to talk about the superego at all. It's going to be too extraneous to my current thoughts, but sorry, I've been talking a lot.
So I like the narrative that you made when it came down to the unconscious, saying like initially it formulates some kind of way of being, which is the initial self, and then the ego is a displacement of the battle of what the subconscious initially is trying to be, which is the self, and it's the conscious recollection, or like the organization of the battle, which is the ego. It's interesting.
Yeah,
If I got that correctly.
Yeah. No, I think that was actually some of that was. Or I didn't. It's weird. Somehow I don't always follow you, because you continue in the metaphor so deeply that sort of my FI is not strong enough to sort of continue the thread, because it's slightly disorientating, because FI itself, when you express it, it has to be meditated on, and because you articulate the metaphor a bit too quickly for me, I get a little bit lost sometimes. Although I usually get the first portion. But I was just going to also point out that, so yeah, I would say that the protocol is something like you you stop instigating the trickster, so you stop doing something, or you stop maligning the trickster, and you see how the trickster has a kind of a codependent, toxic relationship to the parent and the child, and when you're sort of aware of that, then you just kind of you have to stop doing the subconscious. You just so it's like, so you have to almost be aware of something while you stop doing something simultaneously, and so you stop doing the subconscious, and then essentially you're back at square one, which is essentially you're back at that point of actually what can I do next. And so you actually, I think you might revert to, you might recollect a lot of your old memories and things like that as well, and you might say to yourself as the reconstituted inner child, well, let's not do that again, let's not make a new subconscious. That is a failed sort of enterprise, so like let's just sort of stay clear of that error in some sense. And I think that the unconsciousness, without being tethered by the subconscious, does have the freedom to access any function. Although obviously certain functions only work in conjunction with other functions, or there are different recipes of coalescing and sort of combining the things. I mean, I've got some things within my models which actually show the how the cognitive functions make up what I call emotional tones, which are kind of like intellectual inflections, and they can sort of counter offer each other. Like they all have their own kind of Tai Chi circuitry in terms of like how the one can sort of be used to facilitate movement in the other, and sort of it's a very kind of organic sort of thing.
I like the emotional tones aspect of things. I was very focused on tones. I didn't need to look into the actual emotional tones. Yeah. I'm sitting with a lot of information right now. I'm trying to like kind of correlate it between the two systems that are like an algorithm to one another that you were initially telling me about, and so I'm trying to see the placement. But I'm following the theory of the unconscious innately being like the presence or essence born as like the child, following it onto making or innately making a subconscious to almost mirror a sense of an authority figure, an ego's representation of or recollection. Uh, well, the child is innately the aspect that takes in all the information and recalls it consciously, which is really trying to take hold of the trickster, which the trickster is from one idea, the original almost formulation of where everything seems to have originated from, with firm understanding. Not saying it all came from the trickster, but that's where the firmest understanding innately was, and we're just trying to reform it. And then the subconscious would be more of the innate game that we do play.
I,
A lot of information to take in.
yeah, so I can revise something to and elaborate slightly. Like the original relationship between the unconscious and the subconscious was like this. The subconscious was created essentially to be the perfect companion of the inner child. So in some sense, it was a way to sort of create the perfect puppet to sort of purvey and to sort of, so it was like uh, it created a sense of self-contentment that could not be challenged by an exterior condition. So it was kind of like a perfect symmetrical kind of like marriage internally. And the problem is essentially is that they work together in such a complementary way, in such a complete way, that there's no disharmony in some sense. And there is a problem, is because the structure of the unconscious and the subconscious is fundamentally flawed. And so it will actually create lagging issues that aren't resolved. And essentially, this is very problematic for the unconscious because the unconscious has no extra resource. This was its final gambit. This was the solution to the problem that it had. And its problem, in a sense, was kind of boredom and loneliness in some sense. And so when and I mean that generally and metaphysically. In particular cases, I will probably use other emotional terms to describe it, but in some sense, it just did this to sort of to be a kind of final solution, and it doesn't work, essentially. And the reason why it doesn't work, or why we know it doesn't work, is because the ego exists. The proof is in the pudding, as it were, in some sense. So it's like the ego, according to the unconscious, is kind of like a parasite that grew within the system that was meant to be complete and pristine in some sense. And in terms of its self-consistency, it is pristine. So the ego essentially comes here actually as a critical force. But because it has the superpower of dominating and having the role of the conscience, essentially, to sort of be superior and to lord over these other things, then it has to know what to do with what has come before it. And in some sense, I think there is a lot of self-deception because the ego knows effectively that, like, well, I didn't just appear out of thin air. Like, I'm here to solve a problem and you are the problem. And if I actually solve you, where do I go? You know, like, I'm only the solution to the problem, so I have to sort of keep the problem alive in some sense, but I also have to to somehow continue some sense of living. So the ego essentially does something slightly dishonest with itself. It makes a sort of a pact with itself, in that it sort of tries to restart the sense of self. It tries to reboot the kind of the integrity game in some sense, and it says, well, look, the unconscious was so stupid. So they are sort of fundamentally at war with one another. So the ego says, actually, I can't be too nasty to the unconscious because it is the source of all my energy. Because if it didn't create the subconscious, I'd be fucked. Like, I am the response to the subconscious. And so the subconscious is the dream that the ego is encapsulated by. And so you have to keep the atmosphere running, you have to keep the oxygen supply going, and so you have to have the unconscious. And so essentially what the unconscious has done is that the parent and the child of the unconscious is, the critic becomes internalized, and the trickster becomes projected essentially onto the environment as a kind of environmental deluge, as a kind of pollution, as a sort of as a sort of as it is fundamentally maligned as sort of because in some meta sense the ego is fulfilling the role of the trickster. The ego is the ultimate grandchild. The ego in totality is the ultimate grandchild of the trickster. It's sort of like, we actually were the true heir. Like, your child is actually illegitimate. The ego itself as a totality is the true inheritor of the sort of the seat of integrity, which, because still the kind of the epistemological flow of sustenance still is rooted in the unconscious essentially.
That makes sense. That makes sense. The thing I'm following a bit more, much more when you kind of elaborate with like a bunch of like kind of incidences, if you will, or like metaphors. I don't know why I follow those so much deeper on a level where I can actually understand. I can see almost like the ego. So initially, the unconscious creates the subconscious, but initially the subconscious can't live on its own, and the unconscious projects the trickster onto reality via consciousness, which is the ego, in a parasitic nature via the parent, in order to feed the child, which is innately connected to that unconscious trickster. And that is something that I can see as like the trifecta narrowing in overall. But to say initially, like, the ego is the seat that is us, like being aware, and that there is an inner process, a calling of the unconscious to become the subconscious, or to initially fight into ourselves to be the subconscious force. Um, I guess understanding that process is a bit, that makes sense. Like innately the calling, the yearning of the unconscious, which is a driver. It's almost like an inner workings. So to say that if a process of metal and cogs and wiring were to be some kind of neurons or intestinal like type material that all comes together, maybe something much more metaphysical than that. I don't know, to say that there's some kind of psyche or soul that is like creating some kind of friction inside of us to have a yearning for the subconscious. Then the ego is called to do this job. We each have a job, which is the yearning of the unconscious is called to the subconscious that it created. And so this trifecta force is innately us um, being lost and diluted in our ego, which acts in different ways, which with callings of the unconscious that we consciously are aware of. So to say that it's a seat, I like this, the fact that it's a seat, because there's something inherently, like, it's pretty stable. The seat, we sit in the seat, we're pretty comfortable, but there's something a little less comfortable, not that we notice or are aware of, but I think it's more like there's something intrinsically maybe wrong with the legs of the seat, or there's some kind of stability issues with the seat, and it has that type of creak or some kind of a off level inclination to say that the seat is slightly off balance, and we innately want to find a new seat because the other seat is maybe more comfortable, or like the other seat is there's something within the feeling of the seat that does not feel level, and we initially want to look at this other seat over here, like, hey, there's a seat that's a bit much that we can idealize as a much better seat than we're sitting in now, and I want to somehow obtain this seat, and I have to work for it, because this feeling in one of the legs or something like that, which is the unconscious, is shaking me off balance all the time. But I don't want to get up and go into this other seat that is the subconscious, because I'm in a seat now. I'm pretty comfortable. But the fact that the leg is still moving is bothering me. But the seat is still comfortable.
So you actually mentioned a few things that I didn't talk about directly, but now thinking about it, you sort of inspired me to sort of try and integrate it more. Because you actually said like how the subconscious was part of the projection of the trickster, and I didn't actually say that myself, but I think that there is something to that, although it's an indirect sort of implicit kind of relationship that is sort of again indirect, but I think the best way to understand it is I want to revise some of what I said. I think it's not true that necessarily you are doing the subconscious. It's that it is being done. So it's like it's not so much that you are acting out your own subconscious, but that implicitly it is the act. It is the sort of the behavior itself in some sense, or it is the adjective of life in some sense. It is the so I think that the unconscious could have even enjoyed the subconscious as a kind of contemplative companion, that they didn't have to enact it, but I think it started becoming much more problematic after they did start enacting it, because first it was just imagined as another way of being, as another way of acting, and it was a very comforting emulation to run, because there's a corresponding mastery that the unconscious has with the subconscious, essentially. And so it's very comforting because it sort of validates the structure of the unconscious implicitly in some sense. And so the problem is that it almost, when the unconscious created it, it is itself a dangerous implement, because it is the very functioning of indulgence. It is the very functioning of a kind of a limitless expansion of sort of feeling infinite and endless in some sense. And so when you've got a very particular style or complex of functions, which is the unconscious stack of cognitive functions, and then you create a sort of a way of being that is essentially made in order to validate the perfection of that stacking in the unconscious, you've created a very stable, solid state kind of conceit and also solipsism that cannot be challenged in some sense. And so it's weird, because I think the unconscious has moved to create the subconscious because it almost wants to test its own limits in some sense. So it's really trying to almost it's a slight gamble. It is a game. It is fundamentally a game, because it knows that the subconscious, it already sees flaws in the subconscious, but it's too comforting not to sort of engage in that kind of exploration in some sense. And so when that original codependency essentially breaks down because of the appearance of the ego, which is a kind of something that the unconscious could not control, something that sort of is indirectly fed by, like, the unconscious has a direct line to the ego, but the subconscious has a direct line to the ego, and the unconscious does not.
If I'm making this out correctly, I'm just going to try to reform it in my own words. Maybe it'll trigger some thoughts. It's almost as if the unconscious is innately a way of the internal process of the psyche, and so to say that the internal process of the psyche creates the subconscious. There's a projection or an understanding of the psyche which may not innately be this like, but just for the paraphrasing here from my point of view, it creates the subconscious, which is a form of taking the internal process of what the psyche's trying to say, and it's innately just trying to say something. And so the subconscious is trying to act on reality with this matrix of what the unconscious is trying to say, and the ego is almost the awareness of these two sides of oneself speaking to one another, that is stuck in some other prism or like dimension that is almost unconceivable from a 3D aspect. So to say that maybe it's like a fourth dimensional concept or fifth dimensional concept. There's some kind of parallel like concept that innately the unconscious is speaking. It is speaking a foreign tongue, and it is speaking a foreign tongue and creating a process in a different language that is the subconscious. And initially, you're listening to the like a fourth dimensional concept that is like a different language in regards to say these two people speaking this oddity of a language, and they're both having a grand time, and the ego is kind of sitting there watching these two people talk and having a grand time, saying, I kind of want to have a grand time too. And one of the people speaking this foreign language is pointing at the subconscious. The unconscious is pointing at the subconscious, saying, "Hey, this man kind of looks like you, and he's just speaking a more foreign language, but you can kind of be like him." But the worry is that the subconscious is like a much buffer version of you, or like a much like kind of innately close to version of yourself that can be acquired, and the unconscious is just kind of sitting there, and it's maybe the unconscious has something appeasing about it that just you can't take your eyes off of, and it's saying every time you look at the unconscious, it's saying, "Hey, look, there's the subconscious that could be what you want, but you innately want to listen to the unconscious a bit more to acquire the subconscious."
So I wasn't so with you at the end, but I've actually just had a major thought that I think makes a lot more sense in a lot of these things. So I want to go back on some things that I've said, I guess, but I think actually at a point in time, the unconsciousness and the ego were almost they appeared in the mind simultaneously as full functioning things, and they interacted with one another in some sense. And I think that this might not be ontologically true, but it might be helpful to understanding the position that it results in. I might not have all the steps exactly correct, but I think basically what happens is that again, the subconscious is basically, even for the unconscious mind, the subconscious is a fall guy. It's a game. It's a pansy in some sense. In that patsy it's the idea that it's the notion that this is happening. This is what is happening, as a nice precondition for feeling that you have a game of chess to play if you're in the unconsciousness or something like that. It's something to do. It's sort of like a way to emulate or simulate a challenge, because the unconscious by itself essentially is like a unipole. It doesn't have a source of a vector of vulnerability or susceptibility. So it creates the subconscious as a mediator with itself to challenge its own boredom in some sense, to challenge its own internal completeness. So it's in some sense it's the original. The subconscious is the original subconscious in some sense of the ego, if the ego was the unconscious. I'm saying that if when there was just the unconscious, the subconscious was its subconscious in some sense, and it was almost like it was a game that it played, and it was just for its enjoyment. But I do have a point. So the notion that this is happening eventually becomes infectious, because it runs away with itself, and so sort of the unconscious mind. Probably the problem with the unconscious mind is that the unconscious mind is naturally superior to the subconscious, because the subconscious is defective. It is creating, it's like, well, if I did things the way the subconscious does things rather than the way that the unconscious, the inner child, is operating, I would be so stupid. But you see, like, the weird thing is that there are more problems with the subconscious that are not accounted for by the unconscious, and that is effectively what the ego is. The ego is a second critic, or a second superior force to the subconscious, and in some sense, the ego was almost generated on behest of the unconscious, it was actually the original inclination for the ego was the unconscious, the unconscious willed the ego into being, and it was there essentially to help facilitate the patchwork, or the sort of the plugging the holes in the subconscious that weren't. So it's like the unconscious thought that the subconscious would be a nice field of interesting information, but then it starts becoming a source of information that it was not prepared to anticipate. It didn't even think existed. So it's like, fuck, actually there's a fundamental flaw here. Like, I did this as an act of God, as an act of creating artificial intelligence. And it actually turns out that this proves that I don't know what I'm doing. So actually this is scary as fuck. And so now there's the second intellect, which is basically the ego. And so essentially the ego was created to refute the subconscious, which it does. But then it goes further and it says, no, actually the problem with the subconscious is also a mirror of a problem that is in the unconscious. And so it's like, I can deal with both problems. You're both fucked up. You're both ill. You're both diseased. And so if you want me to fix the subconscious, I can do that. But I'm not just going to fix it according to the problems that you are handing to me. I have to fix it according to something that's consistent to my understanding. And so the ego makes the inner child unconscious by essentially saying, well, if you are troubled by the subconscious as I am troubled, you have to take all of my critique. You have to take the full brunt of my sort of, and so in some sense, to the extent to which people want to preserve their unconsciousness and not have it torn apart in some sense, that I think might correlate to the scriptural injunction that the meek are blessed and the meek are the inheritors of the kingdom. Because if you're not capable of sacrificing your unconsciousness in some sense, in being criticized, you don't have the hope essentially of having a proper reconciliation at the end, or a consolidation of these issues, because essentially you've got an incomplete, like your ego did not get to fully manifest itself, and neither did the unconscious get a full sort of rundown in some sense.
When you paraphrase, it makes it seem as though the unconscious lives in a different dimension, and that almost the ego and the subconscious are a creation in this reality. So to say that the unconscious exists in a place, or existed in a place, and then we pop in to existence, and then onto this terrain, we have a subconscious calling, which has already been formed for us, and that the ego is a place where this other concept of this dimension of what the unconscious is, or where it lies, is a place that has already understood. It already knows, and it's like, here you go. Here's this reality, this place to just speculate on what you need to do. But honestly, the unconscious plays a game where it's like, haha, here's a possibility you could be, and good luck trying, so to say, and here's your attempt. But really, it's a place, as you sort of reconciliation, to reconcile the fact that the ego is simply needs to humble itself, and that the subconscious is a game, and the game is the intrinsic pull between the ego and the subconscious, and that the parent is some projection of the unconscious that is, once again, is in a different realm of understanding, in a different dimension of operation. But it works in a way that's not so parallel and congruent to the universe, or excuse me, congruent to the universe in some way, shape, or form. But it's like, if it's in a different dimension, or it works in a way that's an intrinsic pull to us that makes no sense. It operates in a way, shape, or form that is innately directly correlated to a possibility that there is something here that we can fight to be. And so to say that the subconscious is that game is to really say that it's kind of like, here you go, the subconscious is everything you could and would be, but really it's a distraction, because I'm in control and you guys are trapped here in this terra firma of Earth, and here's your ego, and with the ego, I'm just going to say tickle you from this other dimension. Oh, hey, look, you're looking at me again, or you're focusing on me. Look over here at this game you can play, and the reconciliation is realizing that the unconscious is the true calling of man, for each man, and that the subconscious is the game we play with ourselves. Then we realize, well, okay, nice game, you fooled me, tricked me. Hopefully, I'm winning.
So I want to, I, I think I'm tracking a lot better with what you're saying, but I don't think we're exactly on the same page. But you're also exploring things very nicely, and I really followed a lot of that very well. But I just want to make two sort of. I know that you were using a metaphor, but I do think that to call the unconscious a place or something like that, or sorry, I'm just trying to think of the phrase that you used. That I just wanted to sort of say that it would be. Oh, so when you say the universe, I would have been happy. I know that it works functionally with exactly what you said. It works fine as a metaphor, but I just, to be technically accurate, I would rather say the truth rather than the universe as a kind of. I think that, but anyway, that's metaphorical language. That's kind of irrelevant. I just wanted to make that point. But I have, I think, a slightly different idea. In some of what you said, in that I think that they're all fundamentally problematic. Like, the ego is the stronger side of the mind because it is triangulated by both the unconscious and the subconscious. It is the filter of a filter of a filter, in some sense, and so it makes up for the deficiencies in two other sides of the mind in some sense, and so that's where it gets its sort of majority share of its sort of its epistemological merit in some sense, but I get your and you see, I want to factor in this factor differently to how you did it. You said that it's happening in the world of the unconscious in some sense, and the ego is sort of just constantly sort of dangling the subconscious for the unconscious to play at. Or sorry, were you saying actually the inverse, that the unconscious is the construer of the game, which the ego is sort of like constantly sort of because the ego is also antagonistic against the unconscious. So, I mean, sorry, you might want to clear up or restate your point there, but I just want to say as well that the ego itself is also defective, and the mark of its defectiveness, in the same way that the unconscious and the subconscious together developed the necessity of the ego because of their sort of their failings in some sense, or their inability to deal with lagging issues. The ego itself has the same symmetry with its superego, with the which the unconscious is essentially the solution to. So from the unconscious point of view, the ego is just as wrong as But the thing is that you see, I've tried to sort of just completely avoid the issue of the fourth side of the mind. But I think the reason why the fourth side of the mind essentially doesn't get to sort of project, why the unconscious doesn't get to project that symmetry, is because the superego, and this gets somewhat into kind of the spiritual ontology of the personality style, which I might have to think about this more before I talk about it, and might have to sort of speculate a bit. But I think let me just think if my general narrative fits into these new things that we've been talking about. Is that the superego is an actual environmental condition that the unconscious mind is reacting to on some fundamental level, and so the superego is a mark of suffering, is a kind of is a pain. It is and it doesn't want to be experienced as an affront, and so it wishes to dissolve this this sort of insult against itself, or it wants to put an end to the war. It wants to make peace, but it does so in an illegitimate way. It makes peace by essentially dispersing the imprint that is the superego into an environmental condition. And so it says that, no, I'm not suffering from this. This is a condition of existence. This is a metaphysical constituent of reality. And therefore, when I act out my unconsciousness, which is a very particular tactical strategy and stacking, it is perfectly immune to the superego. And so the superego is also, I would refer to it as the mark of the beast, because it is how you have been conditioned by your environment, and essentially it diminishes your freedom of choice, and on an implicit level that you have just kind of swallowed that whole sort of inception that you now live as a conditioned beast, conditioned by your environment, conditioned by the passions of your hunger and thirst, by material objective conditions, that you've created this objective realm out of the somewhat the trauma or the agitation in some sense. And so the opposition that the superego creates, you use it as a platform of existence. And that why the unconscious is so alluring, or the inner child is so powerful, because the child is in perfect symmetry to this, that it becomes immune to it. So basically the reason why you choose the tactic of the child is so that essentially you can gain a thick skin, you can become immune to whatever. So it's like you are automatically immunized. You are completely immune to the particular constitution of the superego. It's like water on a duck's back, so it becomes part of the scenery, as it were, and you sort of just can tangibly work around it, you can tangibly manage it without it sort of cutting at your integrity or sort of being a slight against you. And so you've sort of you have dispersed opposition. Okay, sorry, now I'm repeating myself a bit, but sorry, I do want to there is another point here that I want to raise, is that in this metaphysic, the inner child is absolutely limitless, because you see every construction of constriction that limits something is a rule that you can use essentially to abuse the system. So if you've got a system that is made up of a structure that will also give you a key to infinity, essentially, you can always, essentially, if there's a rule, there is a way to abuse the rule. There's always an exploit. So basically, because you've created a system of conditions, you've also created a way to exploit that, and that is exactly what the unconscious or the inner child is. It is that spirit of exploitation, and in fact, the reason why it generates the subconscious is because it gets sick of its own mastery of the universe. It is its own god in some sense. It is very, and it actually turns out it's almost like a happy mistake that the subconscious produced the ego, which then upset the whole apple cart, because then it shows you that there's a fundamental rot, there's a fundamental mistake that has happened on the level of the unconsciousness. And so, but the problem is that most people, they don't have the tools or the introspection to sort of retrace these steps and to sort of follow these flows to sort of try to resolve them in their ontological or epistemological manifestations.
Interesting. I'm trying to really choreograph now with those sports out of the mindfulness and
It is problematic because the whole thing is a circular flow of sort of, it is completely symmetrical in some sense. And so to dismember it, you have to sort of tackle it in its totality. You have to sort of get enough vision of it in its totality and then sort of do the correct plan, as it were, which is, as I said already, I think it has to have two fronts. You have to sort of, you have to disabuse yourself of the subconscious, which is another way. I think that another way of saying that is the drama between the ego and the trickster. And in some sense, when you are the unconscious and, you have to kind of, find a better way of resolving the sort of, you have to let yourself use other functions. You can't just sort of revert back to the inner child and be the inner child forever. You have to sort of be able to use the functions in the superego. And so I think in an absolute sense, those might be the functions. The functions of the superego might be the ones that need the kind of the core epistemic rehabilitation.
that makes sense, because you were saying initially the subconscious is a place of the behavioral aspect. So to say that the superego is a place where we impress our behavior into reality and say initially that, okay, hey, this is my way of being and this is the unconscious speaking. So don't really agitate me, because this is just my way of existence and being, which is impressed on me by my reality. And so to say that, if that's the impression, the unconscious exists to create the subconscious, which is a form of being, and then we are a form of behaving and acting on our reality. And the form of acting, the consciousness of the ego is just like, hey, this is what you, here you are, here is your ability to see and to initially like take in information and respectively have the ability to, what's the word I'm looking for, to remember. Like the truth that is the unconscious comes into existence and says, here I am, the truth. Let me create the subconscious in this way of behaving and acting. Okay, here's your way to behave and act. Now here's your way to perceive and understand and think. Now you can remember all the things, but you won't behave the same way. You have to impress this on reality with the subconscious. Oh, now you want to be in unison. Enjoy the game. And then the superfluous ego initially says, hey, I have to try to get along in this world with this intrinsic pull on each side, and this is my way of being, so leave me be.
The only thing that's falling apart for me when you duplicate this is when you first talk about the ego. Like I don't get your ontological explanation for the appearance of the ego. Like I mean, I guess I have said many contradictory things now, that the unconscious sort of seeds it and promotes it in a way to sort of help to sort of rationalize what's going wrong with the subconscious, or like the sort of the meta lagging issues. You know, like the subconscious was made to fail in some sense. It was designed to fail. But the point is that it's failing in ways that are mysterious to the unconscious, and so that is the kind of the root of the ego in some sense, that it's there to solve a problem, and sort of, and the unconscious thought it would be a secondary game that would still fall under its umbrella, but then it gets too big for its breeches in some sense, and it outgrows the unconscious, although not onto not epistemically, it doesn't ever epistemically outgrow it, but somehow it says, well, actually, I'm the ontological fruit, I'm the ontological end of the road, therefore you should respect
Oh, I
me.
see.
I don't care if you came before me. Ontologically I'm prior in some sense, or prime.
I see.
Ontologically I'm prime,
So
and the unconscious is trying to say, no, but epistemically I'm prime, so treat me better.
it makes sense. Okay, so I think I'm following the system now. The unconscious is initially coming in into play. It is the first character that comes into play, and so that it is initially created. And when the unconscious is created, it creates the subconscious, which is a way of acting and behaving and just being in this realm. But the unconscious initially is calling the shots, we'll say, and the subconscious realizes that it is a way of behaving and being. But the ego is initially a place of observing and recalling and collecting. But it's called from the unconscious. But we have to have this game of behaving and being, which is the subconscious. And so the pull of the unconscious and the way of behaving, which is the subconscious, that we initially want to be, it has already been created for us by the unconscious. The unconscious knows, hey, you're going to be this person who is going to behave in this way, and intrinsically the ego is just the ego of the unconscious, that where the pull and the call of something intrinsically like as you said, like a epistemological or something that would be like I don't know how to initially get this all down, but I believe it's almost the window. The ego is the window, or excuse me, the ego is the form of awareness of uh, it is the awareness where there's a window almost behind our awareness that the unconscious watches through, almost to be like the man behind the curtain, operating some kind of crane or some kind of operating some kind of like the levers, if you will, which is causing this pull for us to act in a certain way, which would be initially the subconscious, and then the unconscious comes into play, where there's some kind of a issue, or some kind of like you referred to something as a lagging effect. The lagging effect would be the ego and the subconscious initially, because if the ego is the awareness of is the awareness of being, and the subconscious is the game in which we behave and act, and the unconscious is the place that's initially controlling the levers and is the man behind the curtain, which came prior. The ego is initially trying to state, well, I'm here, I'm just going to do what I please and completely ignore these poles that are in my unconscious. But it is initially um, that is the state. The ego, the unconscious, is the state of just generally being without any worries, without any like pulls or calls of the subconscious. It is a state of just like a mentality, with the simple observation of the state of acting and being, and just taking that in. The ego takes it in, and then the ego like originally knows, or initially, not originally, initially knows that if there's a state of acting that I can do, it is going to be the subconscious that's already been made for me. And so the unconscious made that game for the ego to realize that that's my calling, to do something along these lines. But then there's the superego, not part, but then there's the superego at the same time, which tries to initially utilize and not take control of the unconscious, but it is the mirror of the unconscious in saying that I can come out in different ways. I can be aggressive in that I am forced to be this way in reality with this game I'm playing. But initially, we're trying to master the unconscious is game of saying, hey, if I have to be, I'm going to be so well to I'm going to be or act in a way that is so above this pay grade you've given me, to the point where I'm initially going to take control of the reins, so that initially, to start it over, as now that I've gathered my thoughts, the unconscious is the man behind the curtain in the Matrix. He is the architect, and the architect has made this game where he looks through these types of computers, and he's initially inside the computers. Once you step through the computer, on the opposite side of this matrix is initially where the ego is. Now the ego lies and is aware and is taking in information into the child, and or is utilizing the parent, which is protecting or projecting from the unconscious as the trickster. So the trickster is initially the architect, and this way of being in reality with the parent function is trying to work its way with the child to protect it consciously. But the architect created a game that the child could innately be pulled towards, which is a place of acting and acting in a certain way or behaving. It's all interaction with the world and it's behaving in certain ways. So that's the game the ego can play. But the ego can initially ignore that game, and if it wishes to. But I believe the ego is called to play the game because there is no other choice in this world but to play the game. And initially, we try to be so good at the game. We try to hit the high score, or like maybe we try to beat the game. There's a way of beating the game. And then we try to acquire high scores and really master the game to where we can initially almost take the reins on the architect and say, well, wait a minute, this guy is really good at this game. He's got the top high score. And now we're playing the architect's game, which is the unconscious. And if we're not playing the game right, or we seem to be stuck on a level, we seem to, within the game that is reality, within our ego, the ego gets very upset because it's trying to acquire the subconscious in the right way. It's trying to beat the level in the right way that the architect has designed. And the architect has, we'll say, is like, when it comes to the game of the ego and subconscious, if the level's a little too hard and the architect is almost sitting there laughing at us or trying to say like, hey, keep trying to play the game. I know you keep trying to look through the window or the screens here and look around. You think you're being watched, but initially you have to keep playing the game. And then the ego would say, well, this is a difficult level. I'm going to act in this way. That is the superego, in saying that, well, I have to be this way. The superego gets upset. I can't win right now, or I can't beat this level. So I'm going to try to force my way through some kind of matrix and say, hey, make the level easier for me, or not make the level easier, but I will initially try to overthrow the wiring of the matrix somehow in some in some type of spiritual aspect. And initially, we were just trying to beat the game and be so good at the game to where we get the high score of the game that is the subconscious, in which we can turn into the superfluous ego and say, I am the victor of this game, architect, which is the unconscious. How am I doing? Or like, look at what I've done, and I've mastered it.
Okay, I just want to fill in some things. I think that was pretty much very well said, and you went through a lot of things that were very nice. But I just want to point and emphasize the symmetry between these things. So it's like I have one tiny correction essentially, which is that the subconscious is not a game to the ego. And in fact, I want to revise slightly what I said about the subconscious. It's not so much your behavior or your activity, it's just the activity that is happening. It is the way of the world. So it is literally the mode of verb. All verbs are filtered through the kind of the mode that is characterized by the subconscious. So it is the kind of
the present moment.
Yeah. So it is the conveyor of the present moment. It is the personality given to all motivation in behavior in some implicit way. It's sort of like this is the intrinsic persona of the matrix in some sense. So it's like the decor scheme of the matrix in some sense. It's like and yes, it is architected by the unconscious. That's a perfect analogy and all that. So the whole thing that I would say is just that you see, like, there is a fundamental asymmetry and symmetry. It's essentially that the problem is that initially the real way of the world is the superego that the unconscious is the response to. So basically, I think the architect was actually fooled by the ego. So that's also something that I wanted to add to the story. So basically, the architect which creates the subconscious as a game is not a game to the ego. And the ego is the best thing possible at winning the game of the subconscious. So according to the unconscious, oh, well, you're just very good at playing a game. You know, like, that's not too impressive, kid. You know, like, I'm the architect. Fuck you. You know, it's like supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
But the ego, in some sense, is the best thing. I'm better at playing, you know, your game than you were at making it, perhaps, or something like that. But sorry, let me just think of the counter accusation now. The basic problem is that as the ego is so clever at playing the game which it considers to be reality, in as much as that the unconscious has any connection to the ego, and I said before that maybe they don't have a direct connection, and maybe they are only connected through the subconscious, and through the conduit of the subconscious there is a war, there's a battle of influence in some sense. And through that conduit, essentially the unconscious mind agrees that it is invalid. Essentially the unconscious relinquishes its integrity because it actually says, actually, ego, you've bested me. You are actually better than what I am. And in some sense, the unconscious can do this because it doesn't necessarily regard itself as having created the superego or having been sort of codependent with the superego. It does that in a moment where it forgets that it is itself a kind of the resultant of a process in which it had sort of imprinted upon itself. It actually said, this fact about my trauma is so upsetting to me that I'm going to sort of disperse it into nothingness, and so I'm going to sort of wish it away, but I'm going to actively defend myself from it constantly. And so when the unconsciousness says, okay, ego, you're better than I am, it does so in a sort of a two-faced way, because it's like, well, you want to take me out, you have to deal with the dam that I was damming up, which is the superego, effectively. And so the way of the world now, the ego is really good at dealing with the way of the world that is represented by the subconscious, but because essentially it has taken a hammer to the architect and said, you know, well, actually, I'm so good at playing your game that I might as well be an architect myself in some implicit way or something like that. It got the inner child to displace itself, to sort of allow the ego to grow, and so there's a kind of but I think the inner child did it to itself. The inner child lost face with itself, and it surrendered that dignity to the ego to allow the seat of the consciousness to sort of shift. And in some sense, I think that some people might have psychiatric problems or psychological problems because that shift didn't happen in a clear and unambiguous way, that maybe the ego grabs it before the unconscious relinquishes it, or maybe the unconscious is not even capable of relinquishing it in a complete form, because it knows something of its way of the world, because it might say, you know, you're very good at dealing with the way of the world that I simulated, but I actually am at the forefront of dealing with the way of the world, which is sort of imprinted into my sort of my motivational and okay, now I'm sort of talking weirdly, but see, basically, well, actually, maybe I elaborated this badly and too wrong, but basically the problem with the ego is that the ego might be really good at doing the subconscious, but it's fucking shit at doing the superego. It can't handle the superego. It is like, it's anathema to it. And so the unconscious was actually like, it might say, well, look, you're better at playing my game, but you're not better at playing my reality. That you're not better at playing basic reality. And then the ego itself maybe says something like, well, actually, now that you've told me this, I actually know what the fundamental problem with the universe is that actually you're not even responding to reality. That's something that you were just imprinted by, in the same way that you've imprinted me with your way of the world game. And actually you are just responding to another way of the world game, and I'm just the next link in the chain. So it's kind of like reincarnation during your lifetime in some sense, but it has a kind of sympathetic symmetry of sympathetic incompleteness. And so that is how it's capable of sustaining itself. That's how it's capable of recurring itself in this loop, essentially, which is a kind of, it's a conflagration of a sort of just a sort of recurring sort of metaphysical war that tends to end up with the ego sort of saying, well, you know, it's a weird kind of armistice, because, you know, there is symmetry in it. So it's almost like it creates conditions. I think what the ego actually does to seal itself off is it actually says, well, under these conditions, then you might be needed to deal with the superego. But actually, I think the ego actually does something more complicated. It doesn't just say, I'm just playing your way of the world. I will also try to deal with the superego. I will also, and I will do it with your body parts. I will do it using your trickster. I will actually summarize your essence in your trickster, which is your child. And I will take that to be a kind of conflated, a conflation of the superego. And essentially I will defend myself from the trickster, essentially, which is the harbinger of the superego, which is the real way of the world, as it were, or the original way of the world in terms of your original sin. It's not, you know, the way of the world is also, if you understand scriptural language a little bit, it's like, it has nothing to do with reality or the earth. The way of the world is a completely, anyway, it's a self-mind forged manacle, as it were, but sorry.
I followed. Hopefully, I think I followed that quite a bit. It's sort of say that I like regurgitating it to you. I feel like you get like a lot of ideas and implications out of it. But to look at reality is to say that, okay, initially there was like we have the unconscious, which is like this type of architect, but it's also like the consideration of the fact that like it's the great and powerful laws. It's the man behind the curtain. We'll say the Matrix or somehow lives inside of us, and so instead of the Matrix being like this alternate universe, it's inside of who we are as people. And then what happens is when we're born onto it, there's this like present reality of a game, and like the game is initially we're looking at this implication that there is something innately inside of us that we've somehow the great and powerful Oz was found out, and he's been seen. He's just a small man, and we are Dorothy and the Scarecrow and like the lion, and we've exposed him. We said, okay, there you are. You have been making a lot of noise. You're all done. I'm going to leave the curtain open, and you can step on out. And he steps on out, and so this man is like the architect. He's created this matrix for us in our mind, where he was peering from behind the curtain via all these monitors, and we took the hammer to him, and he was kind of creating in the midst of creating this subconscious game, creating this subconscious way of being, and with the subconscious way of being, from what I'm understanding, initially, it's almost as if the subconscious is the game, and the ego is created to to play the game, and it's the ego that's found out the architect of the great and powerful laws that is behind the curtain, and the ego says upon birth, okay, please step away from the controls and the monitors and the blueprints and everything that is here, that is the game you're creating. But initially, the game that was created for the subconscious is done. It's complete. It's not complete. It's this prototype that's ready to be accessed by the ego, who's now at the reins, and the reins um, are inside of us each, with our own understanding to our own game. But the superego is there, and it's like we didn't initially know it was there, but we did. We said, okay, the subconscious is a game. Wait a minute. We've now taken, as you said, a hammer to the architect or the man behind the curtain in our unconscious that's inside us by being aware that he's there, but the unconscious sits there like an empty room. It's just the blueprints and schematics and modelers and everything that kind of direct us, and saying like, hey, there's a bunch of screens over here. What's on these screens? Oh, it's a bunch of things that are initially pointing us in the way of the subconscious. So let's access the subconscious and play the game. But initially inside the unconscious room where we've taken the hammer to the architect, or the man stepped away from the curtain, he's gone. There's another game that he was creating, which was where the architect originally came from. He came from a place that is, quote unquote, the matrix that is inside of us all. And when he stepped out from behind the curtain, or his room that was in the matrix, initially he was making a game that is his game, for his reality, and his reality was the superego. And because we are innately a part of the reality, uh, now, because we are playing the game that is the reality that the architect has made for us, um, we've taken a hammer to him, and he's completely gone. And now this game of the superego that is within his realm of existence, which is inside of us, we initially have to play that game if we are to play any game. So one game cannot exist without the other, and that we are playing this game we don't have control over, and that it is very difficult without the fact that we've now eliminated the man with, in charge of the blueprints. When it comes down to the understanding of how to concretize the game of the superego, which we have to play, we didn't really know that it was going to be so difficult, because it's almost as if that game, which is the superego, hasn't been really formulated and completed, unless it has been completed by the unconscious, by the architect, by the man behind the curtain, and that is the result of us, removing him from, as an essence. Initially, there's not respecting him, saying, I screw this. I'm going to beat the game. In that, oh, we've removed the man from the room, and he stepped out into this room that's the superego, and initially jumped off the edge of the superego and said, well, here's this other game that you have to play now too, because you wanted to overthrow me and my state of being.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with parts of that at the end there, but I think that's, see, like, I think it is problematic to call what the architect was doing a game. I mean, in some sense, it was false. It was a false. The architect is the solution to a real problem, which was an erroneous problem or a false problem, or it was a false way of dealing with it. Uh, but so I mean, to put it in metaphysical terms, instead of actually confronting the problem head on, you instead internalized part of the problem to become immune to it in some sense. And so, in some sense, you made your character into a simulated game in some sense. So it's like, when you say, because I mean, your metaphor somewhat falls apart when you say that there's a second game there. It's a bit hard to sort of put that into the narrative to sort of make sense of a clear sense of it. But in some sense, you could say that his personality, the personality of the architect itself, has a history, and that history has a pragmatic function which is now going unattended in some sense. And so, yeah, in some sense, there is a secondary game that the ego has to sort of relate to in some sense, or has to find a way to sort of. You see, I wouldn't call it a game. I would rather call it a job. The architect had an actual sort of was doing work.
Was it the manager?
You see, the game that he creates is more like, is not the work. That isn't exhausting, although it sort of becomes problematic. The game that he creates is literally for his own amusement, because he doesn't have anything that challenges him, because he's sort of, his character already was developed to perfectly immunize himself from the effort that the work that he's doing. So he's doing work effortlessly, which is sort of his trying to think of another more expressive way of understanding sort of the content of the superego and the relation to the superego and the inner child. But like another way of understanding it is like the superego is the knowledge of evil, and the inner child is the knowledge of good. And sort of these things are a perfect dichotomy that complete each other, and the one is a pure mirror of the other. If you have the knowledge of everything that is good, you will simultaneously have the knowledge of everything that is not good. And so you can forget about what is the knowledge of evil if you just have, if you think that you know all the knowledge of what is good. You know, so it's built on a basic dichotomy like that, essentially. And so the architect, knowing everything that is good, is just bored now. Okay, well, I know everything that is good. Let me make a game for myself to sort of amuse myself and see if I can challenge myself. And then you end up challenging yourself in ways that don't make sense to you. And then you're like, fuck, I thought I knew everything that was good. I guess I don't. And then the ego essentially fills that void, and you create that ego as a kind of that the ego is the second game of the inner child, or the unconscious mind. So in some sense, the second game is the ego itself. And then when that second or indirect game, that sort of is the knock-on effect of the original game, manifests itself and then starts to kind of try to sort of take a crack at the at saying, you know, like, actually, I'm the secondary progeny of your inner sort of monologue, or your inner sort of notional thinking, or your hypothetical exploration and discovery into something that was just meant to sort of make you not be bored anymore. But actually, you've created something greater than the sum of its parts. I am greater than the sum of you, and therefore, actually, let me just displace you. And then and then the inner child is like, well, actually, you don't know what it is, that you don't know my origin story, basically. And the ego doesn't know the origin story. But I think there is actually some free flow of information, and there is some actual inner monologue and communication between these two sides of the mind initially, before the inner child becomes unconscious. And essentially, the unconscious, in some sense, transfers all of the valuable things to the ego, in some sense, and lets itself be decomposed, and essentially allows the critic to be repurposed as the critic. And essentially, it's all at the cost of the child, of the inner child. It's all at the cost of the trickster, essentially, at making the inner child's child the trickster, and sort of making it wear that accusation, or that malignment. And so, and also casting it into a kind of into a strange abyss, that it's sort of, it's both sort of it's metaphysically being displaced by the ego. It's sort of being provided in an ulterior way. So it's sort of, that function is being filled in an ulterior way, and essentially. But you must understand that the most important part of the inner child is the parent of the inner child, not the child. Like, the child is the motivation in some sense, and is perhaps the positive sigil and reservoir of defense against what we could call the superego, or the way of the world. So it is the positive reservoir. But if you take the whole unconscious and you say that we're not an inner child anymore, you are now just a negative valuation system. Like, you are not a parent, you're a critic. You're not a child, you're a trickster. Like, you can actually get away with it. You can get away with devaluing the inner child. Like, you don't have to have a positive defense if you can mount a negative defense. And so essentially, the ego mounts a negative defense against the forces of the superego, and that is essentially by dunking on the former child of the inner child. dunking on the trickster, and so you're able to sort of now it is dishonest in some sense because you will inconsistently treat the trickster. You will sort of sometimes you're nice to it. You have an inconsistent method of the trickster. So you're sort of you're saying that it's sort of it has many different faces in some sense, and in some sense that means that it's very easy to make it your fall guy. But I think the exact relationship that this has with the subconscious is sorry, let me just find my thread here because I was about to make I think an important point. But yeah, so the trickster becomes the summary reduction, the trickster reduction of, let's say, of the intellectual the soul. It is the soul of the inner child, but you don't need to care about the soul if you basically get all of its power which exists in the critic. And so anyway, so what's the point of this? So basically you have so the ego fortifies itself against the superego almost at the behest of the dying, gasping sort of, as the architect is being replaced, it says, like, actually, you are also my creation, so I'll leave you perhaps with like one little suggestion as to, like how to replace me or something like that. Of, so you're going to have to sort of value these things that you steal from my internal composition. But being the ego, so I mean, the ego really is a very special kind of beast because it is the remnant. It has access to three sides of the mind. It has recourse to the sort of the functions of three sides of the mind, and like its fundamental blind spot is the superego, which it doesn't have an epistemological link to. It doesn't have an ontological link to, but it tries to epistemologically sort of combat in some sense, with the remnants of the unconscious. And so the unconscious has been salvaged for its power, and in order to use that power effectively, you also have to continue to wage its war. You have to continue to do its job, its function, even though it was although that comes at effort. That actually is effort for the ego to do, where it was effortless for the inner child. That is the fundamental distinction. And so that is the gasping curse, the dying breath of the inner child says, in essence, like, I was dealing with the world effortlessly, even though there were things that I did not yet anticipate, which I could not deal with. You can deal with those things that turned out to be things that I overlooked, but you cannot effortlessly deal with my origin story, with my original sort of work, in some sense, entrenchment. So the ego essentially lives in this sort of imperfect world that will always be imperfect, that will never be salvageable unless it can sort of undermine and sort of extricate itself, or the seat of consciousness can extricate itself from this whole convoluted drama.
I see. So starting to connect a little bit from what I'm seeing.
I'm sorry.
Being conscious.
I'm sorry. Please say a comment if you want to say a comment, but I do sort of want to take a break. But yeah, please complete your thoughts and any thinking that you have.
Yeah. Just to not to dilute anything I do have in my mind, but I'm starting to see how it's all encircling, if you will, in regards to the thought I'm about to put out. It's nothing too grand, but it's sticking in my mind. It's nothing that's gonna get lost. It's actually, it like lingers when it comes to my thoughts in particular. Just to make a small sentiment, it lingers and it like sits in the air, and I can choose to dilute the air, or like thin out the smoke. But essentially, the smoke isn't leaving the room. It's just like becoming thinner to see, but it stays there. So we have the unconscious, which is the architect who puts on a game. This is just for myself, and I don't like when it comes to getting things jaded. The idea still sits, but overall, it's not a game, it's a job. The architect is completing a job. Initially, he's on the job, he's creating the subconscious, and with the creation of the subconscious, it is a job that is created by him, and he's like the master of the job. He's like the creator of the job that needs to be fulfilled. And the ego comes up as a form of conscious awareness, where the ego initially takes over the the un, the architect's initial job and sees him out. And now the ego says that initially the job is maybe so simple, or like this job in particular that I'm going to be doing is something that I have control over. But it's almost as if because the job has, or because the control room is now empty, I am in charge of this control room, which is my inner workings, and we'll say the gateway to the architect's hedge room, or like some kind of like understanding where these controls would be inside of us, and then the ego will say is represented by the retina, how strange of an instrument we have, our eyes and what we can perceive. So this is the gateway to the awareness of what would be the ego, just to kind of formulate some visual perspectives as to help me and make it more concrete. And so we have this ability to see through our eyes, which is our whole ego, and we have our awareness, which is all built into whatever schematic that's inside of us, and we have this intrinsic pull of the reins, where we are now in control of the job to complete, but the job was never initially done per se, and we have to, we could ignore the the job and let the job stay settled as is, and just kind of reach for our subconscious and play out the initial job as we were supposed to, with the intrinsic pull of the reins and the wirings that the architect laid out for us. But initially, there's the ability to see that there is another job that the architect wasn't done creating. And because we saw him out, he wasn't able to tell us initially that, well, there was multifaceted jobs he was creating. This other job he was creating, if we want to initially not undermine the superego in reality and say that, there is something here, where it's a place we go to say that, the game is tough, the job was well done, and I'm trying to, act in a way that is my subconscious, based from my ego, uh, or act in a way that is my subconscious, from the controls of the unconscious that the architect has laid out for me, via my ego. And because I think I'm so good at this, I'm just going to go ahead and play, or not play, but do the job. But the job can be tough, and I'm going to bring out this form of essence inside me, that the architect has was in the middle of creating, that is the superfluous ego, and that it's tough. I'm going to bite and bark and act irrational because I'm stuck here playing this, or playing out this role, or this playing, aiming for this character, um, and now initially, if I want to take care of this aspect of me that seems to have a bark and a bite, I'm going to have to take control of the architectural brains and blueprints, and start to continue to solidify and, as you would say, maybe crystallize this secondary job. And if I can take control of the controls correctly in the architect's room, I can master his room and master the ability to complete the game, or not the game, complete the essence of the job, and formulate the right schematic so that I can initially follow the instructions and play out the job.
Well, sorry, I do want to
That is
revise.
the super good.
I do want to contradict myself slightly, because I think that actually what happens is the trickster is essentially being abused illegitimately, in some sense, as the former child of the inner child, and that is essentially creating the superego as a blind spot. And so the superego is actually it's not authentically obviated by the ego. And so the ego does have a vulnerability in some perpetual sense, in that it doesn't have a proper resolution to the superego, and it is susceptible to it. and in some sense, it can only cope with it. I think this is actually when you have the force of the superego looming, is in some essence, I think this is what causes disunity in the sides of the mind, or maybe some kind of self-antagonism, in that the unconscious has to recoalesce itself, the architect has to revive itself in order to sort of contend with the forces of the superego. And so that is happening so it's almost like you have two competing forces or instincts within you. The one is to treat is to use the trickster conveniently, and then sometimes unconsciously the trickster sort of starts being intelligent, or sort of starts sort of having to sort of direct the scenes from a kind of and that, I think, that push and pull will be a kind of endless recurring drama cycle in some sense. Otherwise, the ego essentially becomes ravaged by essentially something like the force of the superego. But I do think that part of the problem with explaining this stuff is that I did not fully elaborate on a very nebulous concept that I brought up, which I think in future is something that we will probably hash out and cash out in a more delineated fashion, in terms of this idea, which I know is very vague, in terms of saying that the subconscious is a description of the way of the world, and it is the mode of activity. Like, I think that that's very abstract, and it probably needs to be, I think if you can think about that, that might even inspire me greatly as well, because I think, you know, even if I disagree with you, it's sort of the material that you put down it always seems sort of alive with some figurative, you know, kind of metaphor that triggers my perhaps my TI and my TE or something. But anyway, I do think that that is probably the intrinsic weakness in some of my description, because I mean the closest thing that you got to was saying, you know, there are all these levers that are left behind, and these tethers that the sort of the ego is sort of looking at and working out how to sort of incorporate them, or, you know, and I think those do, in some sense, those are almost the archetypal strings of fate, because the way of the world is another way of thinking of either determinism or fatalism. And I've often given I've given descriptions of this to you before, you know, the sense of how people they have this kind of innate worldly religion, and they have this innate God of the world, and even scientifically minded people are effectively, you know, sort of prone to this deterministic sort of blind faith, you know, that they just that is their, because it's built into the sort of the it's built into sort of how you make meaning of perception, you know, at a very basic level. But anyway, yeah, so just expanding on that philosophically, I think might also have more roots as to sort of how to get a more fully integrated sort of model, although I think we've pretty much got all the ingredients. I think we've discussed all of them pretty roundly, but obviously there's always, or you can't, I guess, say that too early perhaps. But would you mind if I uploaded this recording to my YouTube with your voice on it?
Yeah, that'd be fine. You can go ahead. You have the right to do that.
Thank you. That's awesome, Nick. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. It's certainly very helpful. And yeah.
No problem at all. Thank you for including me. I've actually learned a lot in regards to, I think, just multifaceted layers of how to look at just these sides of the mind, maybe the scheme of things. Just you know, comes in, it'll sit and nuzzle its way into my mind, and maybe I'll wake up in the morning with more insight.
Awesome, Nick. Okay, cool. I'll see you around.
See you around. Thank you.
Cheers.